In medieval times, the original narrow gateway on the eastern wall of the Ypres fortifications was called the Hangoerpoort, port being the Dutch word for gate. During the 17th and 18th centuries, while under the occupation of the Habsburgs and the French, the city was increasingly fortified. You can see remnants of that all over the city today. But by the outbreak of the First World War in August of 1914, the eastern exit simply cut through the remains of the ramparts and crossed a moat. The gateway was by this time known as the Menin or the Menin Gate in English, because the road leading through the gateway led to the small town of Menin. This site was chosen to be a memorial as it was the closest gate of the town to the fighting. And so it was assumed that Allied troops would have marched past it on their way to fight, but in reality, most of the troops passed out of the other gates of Ypres because the Menin Gate was too dangerous because it was too close to the fighting, and there was constant fear of artillery fire here. The memorial itself contains the names on stone panels of over 54,000 British and Commonwealth soldiers who died in the Salient, but whose bodies have either never been identified or never found at all. But on completion of the memorial, it was discovered to be far too small to contain all the names as it was originally planned. And so a cutoff point had to be chosen. The latest date for which men are listed here after being killed is August 15th, 1917. And so the 35,000 missing from August 16th, 1917 to the end of the war were instead inscribed on the Tyne Cot memorial to the missing. It's important as well to point out that this memorial does not list the names of the missing for New Zealand or Newfoundland soldiers, who are instead honored on separate memorials. I've stayed surprisingly unemotional so far in my week here in Ypres. This is day 4 for me here. But there's something about this memorial that really gets to me. You hear the number 55,000, and you know, these numbers, they just become numbers when you're talking about the Great War, because it's just so many. There's just so many. I mean, something like 17 million people died because of that war. But then you come here and you start walking around and you see these names, and they just go on and on and on. You come around a corner and then you see a couple thousand more names, and you realize that every single one of these small inscriptions represents a life that ended way too soon. It represents, in many cases, a mother, a wife, children. And there are thousands of them. And these aren't even all of the names just of the missing from Ypres. These are a little more than half of them. These are a little more than half of just the missing who were never identified, of one army in one small part of one front of this war. This is just Ypres. This doesn't count the men whose graves are known, and those are tens of thousands more. And it's just the British. Then you have the French and the Belgians and the Germans. And then you go to other places and you have Italians and Ottomans, and you have Americans, and you have Austro-Hungarians and Bulgarians and Romanians. It's something to really ponder, just looking at all these names and just realizing what an absolute horrifying waste this war was. When this memorial was dedicated in 1927, Field Marshal Lord Plummer gave a speech, and one of the things at the end he said was, "Now it can be said of these men, he is not missing, he is here." Can only imagine the pain would have been bad enough for a family to have lost someone in the war, but then to not know where they are, to not have a grave to visit. It's one of the reasons why they have the unknown warrior at Westminster Abbey, because he represents all of these names. One of these names on this memorial here could be the man who's buried at Westminster Abbey among kings. It's a right place for him to be. The inscription that you see here, where it says, "Here are recorded names of officers and men who fell in the Ypres salient, but to whom the fortune of war denied the known and honored burial given to their comrades in death." That was written by Rudyard Kipling, the famous British author. The highest ranking officer to have his name inscribed here at the Menin Gate is Brigadier General Charles Fitzclarence, who is a recipient of the Victoria Cross for his actions during the Boer War. But here at Ypres, he was leading the 1st Guards Brigade as they were being overwhelmed by just massive numbers of German soldiers during the First Battle of Ypres. And he was killed and his body was lost. But something else kind of interesting about Fitzclarence, the reason he has that name, Fitzclarence, which is a name often that was given to the illegitimate children of royalty. Well, that's the case here. His grandfather was an illegitimate son of the man at the time who was the Duke of Clarence, but who later became King William IV. And so Charles Fitzclarence was a great-grandson of King William IV, making him a cousin to King George V at the time of his death. The lions that you see behind me that are a part of the Menin Gate are not very old, actually. They're only about 4 years old. They were placed here in 2018, but the originals that were here were battle damaged and were donated to the nation of Australia by the city of Ypres in 1936 as a way of saying thank you for the nearly 13,000 Australian soldiers who died defending Belgium during the Great War. They were restored by the Australian government, and I think around 10 or 11 years ago were placed on display at the Australian War Memorial in Canberra, the capital city. Following the opening of the memorial in 1927, the citizens of Ypres wanted to express their gratitude toward those who had given their lives for Belgium's freedom. And so every evening at 8 p.m., buglers from the Last Post Association close the road which passes under the memorial and sound the last post. Except for the time during the occupation by Germans in World War II, when the daily ceremony was conducted at Brookwood Military Cemetery in Surrey, in England. This ceremony has been carried out uninterrupted every single night since July 2nd, 1928. On the very evening that Polish forces liberated Ypres in the Second World War, on September 6th, 1944, the ceremony returned, despite the fact that heavy fighting was still taking place in other parts of the town. I've had the opportunity to witness it a couple of times this week, and I have to say it is a very moving experience, and I want to invite you to watch the ceremony that I saw my first night here.
They foot grow not old, as those that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun and in the morning, we will remember them.